of families lost and found. The mood in their meeting that night was subdued. No bickering, no laughter, only a general feeling of grim resolve. Now that the children finally knew some things, they all rather missed not knowing them. If only they had proof of what they knew. But all they had was their word, and the word of children they knew amounted to nothing. If the authorities wouldn't listen to Mr. Benedict, they certainly wouldn't listen to children. Rainey and the others could argue all day that Mr. Curtin was erasing people's memories, that dozens of government agents were being held captive on Nomanson Island, but they couldn't begin to explain why it was all happening, and without proof, no one would help them try to find out. "If we could lay our hands on that journal," Kate had said, "do you think that would be proof enough?" "Fat chance," said Sticky. "Mr. Curtin always has it with him." "Anyway, even if we stole it and convinced people to read it," said Rainey, "they'd think it was a hoax. Mr. Curtin's messages have made sure of that." "At least we could read it," Kate said. "You know, it's chock full of information, and some of it might be exactly what Mr. Benedict needs," she sighed. "But you're right. Swiping it would be too risky. I wish we could do something, though." "We're doing all we can, aren't we?" Sticky said. "We're telling Mr. Benedict everything we know." "Speaking of that," said Rainey, "we should send our report. There's a lot to tell." So much to tell, in fact, that Sticky was complaining of a blister on his finger by the time he'd finished the report. A few minutes later, a reply flashed from the mainland trees. "What has been lost may yet be found. Have hope." "Is he saying he has hope?" said Constance irritably. Or is he telling us to have hope?" "Either way," Rainey said, "I think he believes those people might be able to get their memories back. Maybe he thinks he can find a way to do it. That's a pretty hopeful thing, isn't it?" "Assuming we can stop whatever Mr. Curtin's up to," Sticky said. Constance stood up. "You're not helping my hopefulness, George Washington. I'm going to bed." She frowned at the ceiling, then looked at Kate. "I'll need a ride." After the meeting was adjourned and the girls had gone, Sticky and Rainey climbed into their bunks. Rainey hardly felt like sleeping, but he did need to calm down and clear his thoughts, and so lying in his bunk, he turned to his usual method. He wrote a mental letter. "Dear Miss Perumal, every time I think of poor Mr. Bloomberg and his family, my mind returns to you. How would your mother, whom I know you love so much, feel if you just suddenly vanished from her life? It is an awful thing to consider. She loves and depends upon you, and I know you depend upon her too. I never think of you without remembering your mother too." With these thoughts on my mind, I had a strange feeling earlier tonight. Looking around at Sticky, Kate, and Constance, I wondered how I'd feel if one of them disappeared. Sometimes Constance drives me crazy, but now I can't imagine being here without her. I can't say for sure because I have no experience, but, well, is this what family's like? The feeling that everyone's connected? That with one piece missing, the whole thing's broken? That with one piece missing, the whole thing's broken? Rainey paused in his letter to consider. Of the four of them, Sticky was the only one to have a memory of family life. Was it worse for him, Rainey wondered, to have felt loved and then rejected? Or was it worse to have always felt alone? Kate said she had no memory of her dead mother, nor of her father who abandoned her. And Constance, well, they knew almost nothing of Constance, but Rainey had the feeling that she, too, had never known a family. Rainey's mind went back to his last night at Mr. Benedict's house. It seemed so long ago now, yet he remembered it with absolute clarity. Much like tonight, he had felt too worked up to sleep, and despite the late hour, he had slipped quietly out of bed and crept down to Mr. Benedict's study. Mr. Benedict had welcomed Rainey to sit up with him if he had trouble sleeping, and obviously he'd quite expected Rainey to do so, for when Rainey arrived, a cup of hot tea was waiting for him on Mr. Benedict's desk. There was even a little jar of honey, and judging from the way Mr. Benedict's papers stuck to his fingers as he worked, he had already been into it himself. "You have a question for me?" Mr. Benedict said as Rainey sat down. Rainey laughed. "How do you always know?" "I'm not sure," Mr. Benedict admitted. "Perhaps it's a matter of empathy. I know that if you were here, I'd have questions." He scratched the top of his head with one of his pencils. "Though, come to think of it, perhaps it's a matter of odds. You seem the type always to have questions. Thus, at any given moment, it's a safe bet for me to assume you have one." "I was wondering if you ever wish you had a family," Rainey sputtered. He hadn't meant to speak so directly, but once he'd begun to ask it, the words just tumbled out. Mr. Benedict nodded. "Certainly when I was your age I did, but not anymore." Rainey wasn't sure whether to be comforted or depressed by this revelation. He'd been wondering how it would feel for him to grow up without relatives. You grew out of it then? You stopped wanting it? Oh no, Rainey, you don't grow out of it. It's just that once you acquire a family, you no longer need to wish for one. Rainey was caught off guard. You have a family? Absolutely, Mr. Benedict replied. You must remember, family is often born of blood, but it doesn't depend on blood. Nor is it exclusive of friendship. Family members can be your best friends, you know, and best friends, whether or not they are related to you, can be your family. Rainey had drunk up those words like life-saving medicine. Even though the next morning he would leave on a dangerous mission, even though he knew something terrible was coming down the pike, those words of Mr. Benedict's had made all good things seem possible. Rainey had gone to bed thinking of the people he might one day, if everything turned out all right, consider a part of his family. And now, lying in his dark room at the Institute in an altogether different mood, Rainey finished the letter he had begun to one of those very people. At least I had you, Miss Primble, if only for a while. Maybe you weren't my family, but you were the closest thing I had. Maybe that I'll ever have. And now things are awful and seem likely to get worse, and I worry that I'll never have the chance to tell you what it meant to me. Rainey, whispered Sticky from the bunk below. Rainey cleared his throat. Yes? Were you having a bad dream? It sounded like you were crying. Rainey wiped his eyes. I just can't get over what he's done to these poor people. I know, Sticky said. It's maddening to think what might be in that journal of his, to think there might be something we could use to stop him, but I know there's no way we can lay hands on it. Rainey sat upright, bolt upright. Sticky! Sticky nearly fell out of bed. What? What is it? Maybe we're looking at this the wrong way, Rainey said. Maybe we don't have to lay hands on it.